For those of you I haven't met, I'm Ruth Mandel, director here at the Eagleton Institute, and I have the pleasure of welcoming you and then turning this over to my colleague, John Weingart, the associate director of the Institute, for what I know is going to be a really wonderful, fascinating, and educational session. The Eagleton Institute has been delighted this semester, this year, to launch a new collaborative initiative that you're a part of that we call the Eagleton Science and Politics Workshop. This one is the second of two pilot workshops that we've organized this semester, exploring the connections between science and politics. I'm going to just do a little bit of business first and then move into the session. I want to make sure to get the details right, so I'm going to read a few acknowledgments. First, special thanks are due to, you'll know why I'm reading this because I can't get the title under my tongue, due to the Interdisciplinary Job Opportunities for Biomedical Scientists program at the Graduate School of Biomedical Sciences at Rutgers Robert Wood Johnson Medical School and the Robert Wood Johnson Medical School Postdoctoral Career Development Program. Those programs are helping in a very important central way to support today's program. I want to recognize Dean James Millinoig. Where are you, Jim? There you are. And Professor Janet, there you are, Alder, who are joining us today. They are critical to that effort, to this effort, and also Professor Martha Soto. She is with us in spirit, though not able to participate today, but has also been supportive of the development of this program. I also want to recognize the Eagleton Science and Politics Workshop Planning Team, including Eagleton Associate Director John Weingart, Professor Emmanuel DeSico Bloom, sitting next to Dean Millinoig, Dr. Megan Anderson. Is Megan here?
Megan's not here this morning.
She's not arrived? Okay. And then the person who just said that, Randy Chmielewski, the inspired manager of Eagleton's special projects. While we've set aside some time for networking during the lunch at the outset, I want to give everyone a little sense of the community assembled here this morning, and we'll probably be joined by some other people who are stuck in fog and rain and whatever other familiar New Jersey traffic patterns. But you include graduate students from the natural sciences, graduate students from the social sciences, postdoctoral fellows, faculty, and undergraduates. And on behalf of my colleagues and collaborators, I'm delighted to welcome all of you this morning. In the interest of time, we'd refer you to the printed agenda for how today's program will run and for the full speaker biographies. We hope the workshop series will open up new lines of communication among some really good scientists and policymakers, and while doing that, perhaps point some of you toward careers in the intervening spaces. And this has been a very important part of the thinking as we've been talking about developing this series, looking at the ways in which people trained in the sciences can find paths into policymaking and government and careers in which their science training is essential for doing the good work in the public sector. Since it was founded, we were founded in 1956, the Eagleton Institute, our commitment has been to teaching about politics. We've been all on that side of it. And in the words of Florence Peschine, Eagleton's bequest, the, quote, development of an education for responsible leadership in civic and governmental affairs and the solution of their political problems. That is our mission, and we very much hope that what we do here it aligns with that. All the partners and organizers of the workshop look forward to the innovative solutions that might come from bright minds, the kind of minds gathered here today and during subsequent sessions of the series. It's now my pleasure to turn the program over to John Weingart.
Thank you, Ruth. For anyone who doesn't find these wooden chairs completely comfortable, these couches are available. So,
even less comfortable.
Yeah, so feel free to take them. Before we hear from our truly distinguished panel this morning, I want to say a few words about my interest in this subject. I worked in New Jersey state government for 23 years. For 12 years, I was director of a division responsible for determining where new development should be prohibited, where it should be allowed, and the standards that new and existing development should meet. We issued about 1,000 individual permit decisions a year to housing developers, to commercial developers proposing shopping malls, shopping centers, other office buildings, other commercial facilities, to utilities operating nuclear power plants and other facilities, to municipalities, and even other state agencies proposing anything from the widening of a road to a new municipal center to some kind of shore protection structure intended to keep the ocean from eroding the beaches and riverfronts. The decisions we made evaluated the potential impacts on air quality, on surface water quality, on groundwater quality, on plants and wildlife, on engineering, public safety. The division had about 140 people, including many scientists with advanced degrees in biology, geology, hydrology, landscape architecture, chemistry, planning, a number of other disciplines. And what I want to say at the outset in this is that the scientists working in the Department of Environmental Protection, most of them really liked their jobs. Some of them were there intending to be there at least for their entire career. They'd come directly out of graduate school and had no intention of leaving and planned to continue to work there. Some of them were there for a period of time and were working there and then went to take some other job opportunity and used it as part of their career, either at the beginning or at some other phase of their career. So there were all these different backgrounds evaluating all this information. I was the director of the division. My background is I majored in sociology. I have a master's degree in public affairs, which was the study of the operation and structure of government. And my only scientific training, which isn't too elaborate a word, was a couple of courses that I required and I couldn't figure out a way to get out of them when I was in high school and college. And yet I was the director of this division. It was my name, my name that was on the permit decisions, on the approvals and on the denials, and it was part of my job to explain to the commissioner of the department, or occasionally the governor, or reporters, or angry permit applicants who were denied, or angry members of the public who thought a project should or shouldn't have been built, or our decision. It was my job to explain those things. And at the time, and certainly even at the time, but certainly since then, I've thought about two questions about that. One is, why on earth would anybody entrust me to do that, or somebody with a background like mine? And then secondly, how do people in that kind of position evaluate the information they're being given to make a decision? When you're being given complicated and often conflicting opinions and information about areas in which you're not trained, how do you put that into a decision? And that's important in itself, but the flip side of that is maybe more important, is if you want to influence a decision, whether you're on the staff of an agency or you're working for a nonprofit group or you're a concerned citizen or you're an academic researcher and have a point of view on an issue and you want to influence the decision, how do the people you're trying to influence think? I mean, how do you get to them, for one thing, but how do they think and how do they evaluate information? I think that's important for understanding how to have an impact and how both in your job and as a citizen. And I think part of the answer is to know your audience and to understand the context in which they operate, to get some sense of what's the scope of their ability to make a decision. They're operating under a certain law, they're operating under certain regulations, and while you may be trained in an area that is not government and politics, if you're trying to influence or you want to see a governmental or policy decision be different, or you're in the government and you want to have a decision go in a certain way, it's important to understand the context and the ability of the person or group or organization you're trying to influence to move in one direction or another. When I had this job, staff members would sometimes present me with something, and I would say, I don't really understand this. That was okay. But I would sometimes say, well, I understand it, but I don't think the public's going to understand this. Or I would say, how does this proposed opinion, draft opinion, address the concerns of the state senator who sent us a letter about it, or address the concerns of the environmental organization that sent us a letter about that? And occasionally people on the staff, trained scientists, would say, well, that's your job to do the politics. You know, my job is I'm telling you the facts and the scientific interpretation. It's your job to figure out the politics. And I think that's a disempowering attitude. It's an understandable one, but it's an attitude that's one of the things I think we're trying to get at with this program and to talk about and try to understand and build from. Lisa Jackson, who many of you know probably, was the Environmental Protection Administrator in President Obama's first term. She was a staff person in the Environmental Protection Agency. She came to the New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection, I think on a temporary basis, and then was elevated by Governor Corzine to be the Commissioner of the Department of Environmental Protection. She's a chemical engineer by training, so she actually belonged in her jobs, not like me. But she talks about this phenomenon of having people on your staff or people in an agency who say, I don't do politics, that's not my job. And she says, it's like saying, I'm a human being, but I don't do air. So that's sort of the framework that I come at these topics with. And part of the reason I'm delighted to be able to introduce the members of the panel. As Ruth said, not only do you have agendas in front of you, but you have bios of all of us, so I'm not going to go through that, but I am going to ask each speaker to present. And first, Tom Carew is the Dean of the Faculty of Arts and Sciences at NYU and has a long-time focus on learning and memory. Thanks for coming. Welcome.
You're welcome. Thank you. I think I taught you, because there's a lot of kids in my classes that didn't want to be there, so it's conceivable that, I would much rather have this be a dialogue than a monologue, so maybe I'm already getting rogue on the group, but if you want to ask a question while we're talking, I would be delighted. You can't shut me up. I mean, my kids, when they were small, we've been married 50 years, my wife and I, we used to say, Daddy, when you say something you like, you say it again. So point is that I can go on forever, but I'd much rather engage with you even now, so hop on board. The thumbnail sketch of my background, because I was asked to give you that, is I was in graduate school at University of California, Riverside, and finished in 4 years. I was motivated to get out, and then joined Eric Kandel, a fellow at NYU, as a postdoc, and then was a faculty member at NYU and then at Columbia Medical School. And why I left Columbia, I could have been there forever. It was wonderful to do science. It was exciting. It was a team. We thought we could, conquer the world on Thursday and take a break on Friday. The fact of the matter is that I miss teaching a lot. And medical school is a great place to be, and I still love colleagues there. But I missed undergraduates. I missed undergraduate education. So I was lucky enough to get recruited to Yale, and I was there from 83 to 2000. And then I moved from Yale to University of California, Irvine, to run a neuroscience program there. It was already very strong, and we made it stronger. And my buddies who were at Yale, and I was leaving, said, what's wrong with you? Are you crazy? One of them was Sue Hockfield. Anybody know who Sue was? She was president of MIT. We published papers together. She's an old friend. She goes, why are you going to UC Irvine, right? And the mantra at Yale was, ooh, gosh, we're being taped, but I have tenure. The mantra at Yale was, we've done it this way for 350 years, don't mess it up. And I wanted to mess stuff up. So at Irvine, it was like, come on down and make something happen. And that was really fun to do. Along that way, an important event, well, I'll fast forward to New York and go back to Ryan. Then in 2011, I was recruited to NYU to become Dean of the Faculty of Arts and Science. And it's a little bit like your experience, John, only in reverse. The reason I took the job, it's a big job, there's 1,000 faculty, 10,000 students. But every day in my office, literally every day in my office, I'll have a poet and then a Chinese scholar and then a physicist. And that to me is just a privilege. It's a movable feast. 90% of it I don't understand, but I get the chance to understand it. Folks come to see the dean because they want something, and the front end of the rule is you got to tell me what you do before you tell me what you want. So I get a mini symposium every time there. And it's really a way to connect because no one lights up more than when they're talking about dark matter or Tortonagua or the history of the Chinese Silk Road. So for me, it's a privilege to do that. The thread that binds those sort of academic trajectories that might inform this morning has to do with the importance of education writ large and the way I think we can do a better job, especially at the graduate level, in preparing students for career paths. There was a boom in this country after the Second World War up to, I'm going to say, the 70s, where the belief was that science was infinitely expandable. Universities being added, there was a can-do attitude, and it was a phenomenal time to be in science. I was privileged to be part of that by, the fact I was born then, had nothing to do with any skill set. But it was a wonderful time to, it never occurred to me I couldn't get a job. It never occurred to me I couldn't get a grant. Because you had to be okay. I wasn't stupid, but it was not like you had to be some genius. And now it's really tough. We are in a Malthusian dilemma right now. You probably know the basic rules. Rules are that population grows exponentially and food grows arithmetically. Do the math. So in terms of the science that we do now, there's going to be a lot of pressure that one can see as purely negative, that we've outgrown it, it's unsustainable. And in fact, there's a good narrative to be had there. But the flip side is that it's inspiring a lot of folks to look for opportunities for career paths that when I was a kid would have been considered a default state. When I was a kid, if you didn't become a professor, I was in Berlin for 5 years, and many of those folks knew they'd never get jobs. The jobs in Europe then were, and they just did it anyway. They wanted to get a degree, and then they're driving a cab. But they just loved to learn, and they inspired me a lot at that time. And so what is now present, and I'd love to get your views on it, speaking to Janet and Shanika has already given me some great ideas of what we could do a better job of, and that is to inform our young colleagues of career paths and not to call them alternative careers. I know it's a nuance. I fought that battle at NSF, and they were not pleased with my being salty about it. I fought that battle a lot. It's not an alternative career, in my mind. That's plan B. That's a default state. There's a lot of wonderful career paths that should be prepared for by virtue of just being critical thinkers and hard workers, knowing how to organize data and interact with people and how to write. And so what I would love to find, and your program here is inspiring to me already, are ways to make sure that our young men and women know that there are these wonderful career paths that are available to them. My own if I look at my progeny, I wrote them down just this morning. I have regular tenured profs, but I have college teachers, director of career advising at Harvard, CEO of Cell Press is a student of mine. One's a lawyer, does intellectual property rights. She loves it. Question of agency, if who's acting when, is it your brain do it? Did your amygdala make you do it when you did something? It's a real deal, the question of anybody in philosophy know the trolley problem? Is there anybody in the room? Okay, we'll go there another time, but it's a phenomenal issue that asks the question of, are you responsible for your behavior? I'll give you the trolley problem. 2 seconds, I can't help myself. So, fork track, 5 people tied down on one track, and one person on another, you have a switch. Comes the train, you gotta make a call. Do you switch to, there's 1 or 5 people? Most folks go for the 1. It's not a good choice, but it's better than 5. So most folks are willing to throw the switch. Now you take the same question, but you put the person on a trestle over the train. Only 5 people are tied to the track, but you can push that person off in front of the train and stop it. So you save the same 5 people. Most people don't want to do that. Most of the time they go, when I told that to my granddaughter, she says, Grandpa, what's the matter with you, right? They're going to push them off. However, if you let the person move 12 meters over and pull a lever and a trap door drops, it's a little better. You can feel it already, right? It's a question of agency. How close to you as the agent of your action? And if you want to extrapolate this to an interesting question, think about drones, right? You go to work in Texas, pick up 2 quarts of milk on the way home, honey, how was your day? And you've been at a video game all day, but your actions somewhere really remote are non-trivial. So where I'm going with this is in neuroscience, there's this whole question of agency and who's driving that bus. So right now, neuroscience can inform those kinds of questions in a very interesting way. And that's what my Angela Purcell, the lawyer at my shop, is. So let me cut to the chase so I can hear what matters to you. First of all, there is a real pressure on labs to produce. There's a deliverable. And the pressure on grants right now, in my own view, are unsustainable. I think that we're punishing creativity. I think we're punishing risk-taking. I think we're tying it only to translational research. There's a lot of things I think are just pressures that are driving it. And so the question is, how do we prepare our young men and women, like Shanika, who's heading off to teach, or to be a writer, rather, in Indiana? How do we prepare them for that? Well, one thing is the PI prepared for that? Does he or she get it? So I'm going to make a false bifurcation here. Folks that get it as a value and folks that don't. And the folks that don't are not bad. They got a grant to get out. They got a deliverable because they got to produce on. So they're not bad guy, good guy, but there's those that get it. And I'll tell you an interesting story that highlights that. So I was privileged to be president of Society for Neuroscience. There's about at the time, 42,000 members. And when I was president, anybody know what Brain Awareness Week is? Any folks? Yeah, okay, of course you do. You probably did it. You were out on the brain bus. Manny's out there saying, here, do you want to hold the brain? It's really fun. Well, the point is that there's an award given by the society for students that participate in this, bringing this exciting kind of machine between our ears to kids in the street, to the public, going out to schools. And there was a young man that won the award from Seattle. And he showed up, and, you get your picture taken. He's handing the award. And afterwards, I said, your PI, I didn't know what lab he was from, must be really thrilled for you. And he says he doesn't know it. He wouldn't tell him. Why wouldn't he tell him? You know why he wouldn't tell him. Because he's supposed to be at the bench. And so this young man's off, bootlegging this endeavor because he valued it, but he didn't want his boss to know because he's supposed to be at the bench. I'm not saying the boss is a bad guy. In this case, it was a male. I get it, but the fact of the matter is that this young man had a desire to do something beyond the traditional, stand at the bench. And so there's that's one category. And I fully admit these are false dichotomies. There's a whole range. But the other side are folks that really get it and encourage them. So I got it. Lots of my friends got it. Janet got it. That you encourage your students to go teach. You encourage your students to take a workshop in entrepreneurship. But are we training you the right way? So, and the real dilemma is the culture change that has to happen for that to be not just embraced, but seen as our mission. I would put it even tougher. It's our obligation to you. And the second thing is, let's say we buy that. We buy the premise. So given, are we training you effectively for that as a journalist, as an entrepreneur, as someone going to go into policy, as someone who's going to write? If we had that at the front end of our minds, we should probably not. We should probably provide other opportunities that will compete with the deliverable, right? It'll compete with what the lab has to get out to get that next grant. Not has to get out, wants to get out, but you know what I'm talking about. So that's the cultural change that I think we're really challenged by. This place is wonderful that way. The iJobs is a perfect example of institutional recognition of that as a value. That's the first step. The second step is getting the PIs not to just say it's fine in principle, but by the way, you're not going to be here for 3 weeks in the summer because you're going off to a conference somewhere. Well, 3 weeks is suddenly not a weekend. So is he or she ready for that? And in not just saying, okay, go do it, but says, that's a good thing for you, go get trained there. Embedded in all this is really a cultural change, because those of us who are senior scientists grew up with the lab being our space, and we just loved it, and we rocked, and our students had a good time. But are we now ready to prepare you for these other kinds of careers? And I would suggest we are, sorta, and we can learn from good colleagues, to me, slightly to the east. Well, I guess to the west, where I am, yes. And west of New York west of New York is like the Andes, as far as I could. But the other part of it is how do you implement it? And the ideas are fine, but what are the structural implementations that we can do to let you know what opportunities are there for you and if we're preparing you for them? And I'd love to get your view on that. Second thing I was asked to comment on, but I'm happy to defer on because it's a real right turn from this conversation. It has to do with how neuroscience and cognitive science can inform teaching. I'm happy to talk about that, but I also don't want to take your time. You want 2 minutes on that, or shall we move on? It's okay? All right. Who knows who Roddy Rodiger is? Oh, I have a present for you. This is a beautiful mind. All right. Roddy is at WashU. His real name is Henry Rodiger. Everybody calls him Roddy. He's done a lot of cool stuff that you probably know about, implanted memories and false memories. But the work that I want to tell you about has to do with retrieval-based learning. So it is reasonable for us all in this room to assume that when you learn something, the event of memorizing, I'm getting Janet's name, and I'm remembering that her last name is like a tree, and it's Alder. Okay, got it. So when I'm encoding that, that's the event where the learning's happening. And then when I practice it, I'm just reflecting what I've learned. Wrong. When you practice it is when the deep encoding happens. When you practice it, it's not just bringing to mind what you've learned, it's an encoding session. And the insight is pretty cool. Roddy has, look him up, or I'll give you his, it's Roediger. He's got a science paper a few years ago that's mind-boggling. 2 groups match, typical kind of study. One group gets test material. I think it was matching Swahili words and English words, I'm not sure, but it doesn't matter. One group gets the test material 4 times, pop, 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 retest. Another group sees the test material once. And all they do is they retrieve it 4 times without feedback. And they outperformed the other group amazingly, and their long-term memory was phenomenally better. And they only saw the test material once, but they retrieved it 4 times. So the point is that retrieval is an active encoding event. So when you're teaching, and give a lot of tests. You don't have to make them count a lot. Give them a lot of tests. The kids actually like a lot of tests. If you're not each one, the life depends on it, but give them a lot of tests. So they have to bring it to mind and work on it. And at a neuroscience level, we don't know how that works yet at all. It'd be glib, but there's a really interesting hint. Who knows what reconsolidation is? Anybody know about that? All right, this is cool. So there is in memory a point of encoding where a memory is fragile. Yeah? So I learned something, and sometime thereafter, that memory is not yet solid. It's often called the consolidation period. During that time, I can mess up the memory by distracting you or having something happen or even with a drug. So the memory is fragile, labile. Sometime thereafter, it becomes encoded and it's stable. So that period, the first end I talked about is called the consolidation period. Fine. And we've known that for more than 100 years. But what wasn't appreciated is that when you bring something back to mind, that is when you now have a long-term memory and you bring it back to mind, the memory gets labile again. It's called reconsolidation. There's better ways to talk about it because there's implications for that language that has a mechanistic overtone. Doesn't matter for this conversation. The fact is when you bring that memory to mind is yet again labile. And it can be modulated. Well, can you think of where that'd be important therapeutically? How about PTSD? How about a chance to bring something to mind and have it be labile again and then gradually try to change the valence of that memory, maybe not the content, but the valence of that memory to reduce human suffering. So this is non-trivial. But in Roddy's point, what I thought of as soon as I saw his data was that this, just in a benign setting of just retrieval when you're sitting at your desk trying to study something, the fact that it's labile means it can be reinforced. So I guess the long-term message is for our teachers is don't take the test as simply a reflection of what is learned. The test is an encoding event, and you can exploit that in the service of trying to promote memory formation, either at a clinical level or an academic level. So those are the 2 domains I was ready to talk to you about. Maybe we want to keep going and then take questions.
Yeah,
I don't know
why
whether you
don't we
want
do
to.
that?
Yeah,
Yeah,
I don't
why don't we
mean
do
to.
that?
I don't want to go rogue on you, so I'll pass it to Heather. You're up.
Okay. So Heather Howard, and you have her bio too, was the Commissioner of the Department of Health and Senior Services in New Jersey for 4 years, I guess, or so, and now directs 2 programs at the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation on healthcare-related issues.
Thank you. And Tom is a hard act to follow. So maybe I need to go even more rogue. But I'm thrilled to be here. And my background is actually similar to John's. I'm a lawyer by training and a policy wonk. So I'm not a scientist. And I've found a way to do health policy and not have a scientific background. I majored in history and Spanish at Duke, and then I went to NYU Law School. Was a TA for John Sexton, and he was the dean. And moved my way through. It's like a civics lesson. I've worked in every branch of the government. I worked in the legislative branch in the House and the Senate. I worked in the judicial branch. I clerked, and then I worked in the executive branch at the Department of Justice and at the White House on the Domestic Policy Council. And then I got convinced to come up to New Jersey by John Corzine. He was a U.S. Senator when he became governor. Convinced me, and it's the old saw, but it's true that there's so much activity at the state level. So come to Trenton when he became governor and moved up and have been in New Jersey ever since and got to work with great people in the legislature. Upendra's now doing even different stuff, but got to work in Trenton, and I was in the chief of policy for Governor Corzine at the beginning of his administration, then I was the commissioner. So I've seen, so I started as a generalist and became a health policy guru, and I've seen what it's like to do that kind of policy when you're not a scientist by training, but you rely a lot on scientists. So I think I'll talk about that. I'm a big believer in administrative procedure, which sounds really, really unsexy, but I think is actually a really important concept to talk about, which is what happens behind the curtain in policy and government. So my day job now is working on implementation of the Affordable Care Act and teaching courses on that at Princeton at the Woodrow School. Huge statute passed in 2010, 2,000-page law, but 5 years later we're still implementing it, right? So much is still happening on the details of it. So, it gets a lot of attention what happens in Congress when you're the sausage making of a law, but actually even more happens behind the scenes on implementation and at the administrative level. And that's in particular where a lot of health policy happens and a lot of scientists can have a really important role. And so when I was Commissioner of Health, my job, I had a number of physicians, nurses, other scientists on staff. I felt like my job was to defer to their expertise and to protect their expertise and to make sure their expertise was getting called on in the right way. Doesn't always happen. I mean, the vagaries of politics, we can get into talking about things like vaccines and quarantines and things like that, but my job sometimes was to run interference, so we could get more into this, this issue of should scientists do politics, and they should, but sometimes the smart scientist is often letting somebody else run interference and take the hits. So this whole issue of I'm a big believer, to the extent you can, to minimizing bad politics in health, so that you're deferring to expertise in the right way and letting the right people make the right decisions based on an evidence base. And doesn't happen always, we know, in Washington or in Trenton, but hopefully you're maximizing the conditions under which an evidence base is informing decisions. So you don't need to be a scientist to be working in health policy, I felt, because often the job is about making decisions about allocating resources depending on competing policies, and so you have to, in a world of limited resources, how do you make those decisions about allocating resources? So you're not always going to be successful, but how do you, just this week I was teaching about, there's a new report out from Health Affairs, some of you may have seen it, estimating $4 billion a year spent on miss and overdiagnosis of breast cancer. Did anyone see that? So really interesting question, and there's a little bit of a mismatch in terms of the U.S. Preventive Services Task Force the recommendations for mammograms for women over 50, but then Congress wants to mandate coverage for women 40 to 50, and you've got really interesting politics coming to bear there. And we were just teaching it to undergrads, and I had one student who's from Long Island and who was speaking up about the culture of breast cancer advocacy on Long Island. So if anybody's an anthropologist, you may know, But anyway, so this mismatch and who in Congress wants to be against breast cancer screening, or Zeke Emanuel? Folks know Zeke Emanuel, who recently he's been talking a lot about how we shouldn't how he doesn't want to get an annual physical. Folks seen that? And he also got a lot of attention because he said he wasn't going to do any preventive care after 75 except for his flu shot, right? Did you see that, Tom? Have you followed Zeke Emanuel? Yeah. And and so he's obviously trying to be provocative, and he's selling books too. But so this issue of where do you set standards, where do you allocate resources, but politics is always behind the curtain, especially with an issue like breast cancer or autism. We were talking about, Manny. What services are you covering? Parents want the newest and the latest treatments covered, but there's always a question of, again, in a world of not unlimited resources, what can you fund? Maybe I'll end with saying that one thing that I've always learned, having been on the policy end of it and dealing with scientists, is that you do have a translation issue. That it was always hard when scientists would come in and start with their research methods. which I know is what you're taught to do, right? But that doesn't translate well, and that's certainly not what, it's not what senators and governors want to hear. They can't absorb that, and they don't have, that's not what their day lends them towards is, so how do you translate what you've spent a lot of time and you've been owning, and it's not to minimize all the amazing work you've done, but how do you translate that in a way that policymakers can absorb and listen to? I mean, I worked for a senator who would read things that were longer than one page, but there was once a senator, not Lundberg, I'll look at Doug, but Senator Torselli used to say, like, he didn't want anything more than a page. And so, think about that. I mean, so you've got some people who are saying, you can't give me anything more than a page, so how are you translating your perhaps life's work on something into a page? Because they've got so many different things they're working on, and they're going from one thing to another. So how do you make your research relevant to policymakers, and especially ones who do want to absorb it all but are dealing with so many things? But this issue of resource allocation and competing priorities is so important, and it's become all the more acute as budgets have gotten that much tighter, and so you're fighting for competing resources with many worthy causes, and so how do you make the case? Well, I'll end with one final story. Some of you may remember, and I've taught this, John, when I've come up here to talk. Kitty College, do you remember? You were in the legislature when Kitty College happened. It was a daycare center in South Jersey that had been built on the site of a former thermometer factory. I mean, what are the odds, right? What are the odds? But there were beads of mercury in this daycare center in South Jersey. And so what happens? Well, there was a comedy of errors on how that had happened. The DEP, John wasn't there, probably shouldn't have given a permit for building, and so basically you've got preschool age kids in beads of mercury, and outrage, right? This is an outrage. How could this have happened? So in the course of 4 years in New Jersey, the legislature reacts, says, okay, now we need to license all daycare centers, and we need to regulate the indoor air quality. So they pass a statute that creates this new regulatory framework. No other state in the country has it. Then it comes to the Department of Health, where I'm commissioner, to publish regs on what the indoor air quality should be at a daycare center. And then we have to work through all the issues of who's going to pay for that testing. So then all the YMCAs and the mom and pop daycare centers are paying to test the indoor air quality. When the odds are that there's not going to be another daycare center in New Jersey that's built on the site of a former thermometer factory. And then I remember when I was the commissioner coming to me, the environmental groups, God love them, coming to me wanting a standard that was so protective that you wouldn't have had a daycare center within 1,000 feet of a gas station or a dry cleaner. Well, this is New Jersey, the most densely populated state in the country, where there's a gas station or a dry cleaner everywhere, right, in every strip mall. So you could have a standard that's incredibly protective of children's health, but you could have, that could result in there being no daycare centers, so talk about competing policy priorities. Do we need daycare centers? Daycare centers are not profit centers. You're asking them to pay for so you run through all this, and I've taught this to students, and at the end you go, and is that the number one children's health issue in New Jersey? Think about how much time and money and resources we've just spent on creating a new regulatory structure for protecting children, and maybe it's not the number one threat to children's health in New Jersey, but it was a compelling one when this case happened in South Jersey, and so I don't mean to minimize what the legislature did, because you react to an incident, but it's really hard to be the policymaker saying, no, maybe we shouldn't be bend over backwards to protect children's health in daycare centers because we've got all these other competing priorities and you need to see the bigger picture, right? That's not a fun position to be in as a policymaker, to be saying, no, I'm going to choose a less protective standard because da-da-da-da. So that's just one example of where you don't get to be pure, and you have to see the broader issues. You have to see the entire playing field and think about what's coming down. And if you've only got so many resources and you want to be protecting children's health, what's the best way to do that? And and sometimes it's not. You got the decision in front of you. You cannot take in the abstract. You have to see much bigger. But I had to face criticism from the environmental groups that were saying, well, why are you adopting a less, I was the commissioner, a mom, my son is a cancer survivor, deciding on a standard that was less protective of children's health because I was trying to see a bigger picture. So that was that wasn't fun. So anyway, so that's just one example. We can delve into it, but that's the kind of example you might face going into working in policy, having to balance those kind of competing priorities.
I just add a postscript to that. I knew a woman who was a health physicist with a doctorate who, when she got out of graduate school, had the opportunity to work for a nuclear power company and work at a nuclear plant, which she was considering doing because she thought nuclear power was a good, could be done safely and should be part of the nation's energy mix. She's also a contradance caller, and she ended up deciding that in the community she operated in socially, she would have to be so defensive about working at a nuclear power plant that she ended up working as a radiation safety officer at Princeton University instead. So there are all these kind of perception issues and things you have to deal with. Upendra Chivukula, as Heather alluded to, was a member of the State Assembly for 13 years. He was the mayor of his township, of Franklin Township, and he's now a commissioner of the Board of Public Utilities, the state appointed by the governor and confirmed by the state senate to that post. Thanks.
Thank you, John. I just want to thank the Eagleton Institute and Robert Wood Johnson Medical School for this opportunity. I'll start with my background. My background started in India, where I got my bachelor's degree in electrical engineering, and there is a 5-year degree program where you study civil, mechanical, and electrical engineering. So I'm comfortable with all the different types of engineering. Came to United States to pursue my master's degree in electrical engineering, where in India I did the power engineering, and came to United States I did my communications and control theory. So I got the degree from City College, New York, and started working for, when I came to United States, politics and all these things were not even on my radar. I started working for CBS television network, where I was audio, video, maintenance engineer, goes back to Walter Cronkite's times, which was a long time ago. And then I worked for a company in New Jersey where I was designing the nuclear and fossil power plant operator training simulators, and basically trying to replicate what happens in a nuclear power plant or a fossil power plant, and creating the control room design, and through software we was doing the work. I worked in a waste treatment plant in Pennsylvania to create how to control the waste treatment plant. Then came back to New Jersey, where I did work for AT&T Bell Labs for 18 years, where I did anywhere from testing this special service telecommunication service circuits like 800, 888, those lines. I did work in federal systems where satellite communications, some defense systems, worked on digital signal processors, marketing for voice recognition, speech synthesis, and all the digital signal processors are in your cell phones. Or worked on the mobile technology, communication technology at that time, long time ago. And wrote some books on best practices from concept to design to manufacturing and testing, published by McGraw-Hill. It's a group work, teamwork, and also did some work on supply chain management. And they might be wondering, what am I doing in politics? And so it was a transition that had to take place from being an engineer. Engineers are not very good communicators because they communicate the sciences and engineering aspects of it, but you have to sell your idea because you are selling your idea to the policymakers and officials, and which requires a different skill set. And communication, oral communication, written communication, again, you have to make it attractive so that way you can sell your communication, what your ideas are. And interpersonal communication, you should not be a silo. You should be able to mingle and work with other people with different backgrounds and be able to get your idea across. I think that's a big challenge. So I had to go through certain training to make sure I was ready for that. And I stumbled into politics, elected politics. I was just trying to get the community engaged, especially at that time. the Indian American community was, and the South Asian community and Asian American community, small in New Jersey, and try to see how we can engage them in the political process. So next thing I know, I find myself to be heading a party, Democratic Party. Then I became a councilman in Franklin Township, and where I learned about the land use policies, how you try to address the issues of the local ordinances, and whether it is healthcare, whether it is the public health, and then you have looking at the transportation and a number of issues. I learned about that and how you take your knowledge from the sciences that you learn and translate that into public policy. Then I went into the state legislature, where I became the chairman of the Assembly Telecommunication and Utilities Committee, coming up with a policy. I was firsthand, I had the opportunity to take my real technical knowledge into policy making. And of course it was difficult. I was one of 120 legislators, 40 senators and 80 assembly members. And hardly you have one or two scientists, maybe engineers. And again, as Heather Howard, whom I had the distinguished pleasure of working with under Corzine administration, not only in New Jersey, also in the U.S. Senator's office. She was the chief of staff for U.S. Senator Corzine. And it's so difficult to communicate about science, the importance of science. It's so much relevant right now. We're looking at the climate change issues, and there are deniers of the climate change, and the way I look at it is whether you deny or accept it, climate change offers you opportunity to start a whole new economy, green economy, where you can create a lot of jobs. It's all about, when you're an elected official, when trying to see how you can create jobs, and so people can get gainfully employed and pay taxes, so we can provide services to those less fortunate people. And so that is one of the things. And I think when you look at the different careers, when you are a scientist, and you don't have to run for political office, but you have ways of influencing the policy making. And of course, you need to figure out how to do that, and policy advocacy is an important thing. Currently, I'm at the Board of Public Utilities. We vote on billions of dollars of things, whether it's related to electricity, related to natural gas, water and wastewater, as well as cable television and telecommunication. It's a very exciting time for, we need more scientists and engineers in the policy-making arena, because if we shy away, and of course, when Dean talks about it, when Dean talks, it's very involved in terms of the neurosciences, the applications, in terms of the education, but the practical aspects of it, and see how you can really touch the people, and you can do that in the public domain. Public sector, you can really have the opportunity, whether it is the Affordable Health Care Act, where you are able to engage. It's a phenomenal legislation that was able to increase additional 30 million subscribers to the healthcare who are denied, and they're able to at least have access to be able to get the healthcare. And then you look at the environmental issues. You look at it, 38% of the U.S. electricity comes from coal plants, and another 20% comes from nuclear plants. Coal plants, when you burn coal, not only the air quality issues you have, also the coal ash, which has heavy dose of arsenic, and which gets into your water supply system, you're not going to recover that. A lot of people are going to die. And so you need to think about what are the alternates. How are you going to transition from the current fossil-based energy generation to the green generation, making green energy from solar energy, wind, offshore wind. New Jersey does not have that much onshore wind. We have a tremendous amount of offshore wind. How do you make it economical so that way it can compete with other technologies, whether it's the nuclear technology or the coal-based or natural gas-based energy generation? So I think scientists play a very important role, especially in terms of the reliability issues, in terms of the grid that is changing. bringing about smart grid. There's tremendous amount of data that is collected from utilities area. And so how, whether data analytics is a great business that New Jersey can get involved in. And I had the privilege of sponsoring a legislation which has become a law in the state of New Jersey, where you create a cyber infrastructure for the state of New Jersey. And it's called the big data legislation. And Rutgers University drove it, and Montclair State, Kane University, Princeton, all of them are part. How do you take the scientific data, the academicians, the researchers, and able to share the data without a compromise? Because then the security issues come into picture. When you talk about Heather Howard's healthcare space, privacy issues are tremendous. How do you handle the privacy issues? And safety of nuclear plants, what John talked about, nuclear plants, you have the on-site nuclear waste and all that. And 20% of the U.S. Energy comes from nuclear. And there are a lot of vulnerabilities. How do you protect that? And so there is opportunity, and data makes a big thing. In this, New Jersey can be a real hub for data analytics. We have the real infrastructure for it. I think that's what one should be looking at. And fracking. Well, I don't know how many of you are familiar with fracking. We were doing the fracking for last 60 years, but what has changed is the horizontal drilling. Now it goes, Marcellus Shale, you go 8,000 feet below the ground and straight down, and then you go 1.5 miles in each direction. And when you're going there, even though you have the casings and you're protecting, you go way below the water table, but the chemicals that are used, whether it's a citric acid, whether it's things that are to prevent the corrosiveness of the pipes. But whatever the water goes in, that the water has to come back up. And what do you do with that water? What are the challenges associated with that? That's all science. And EPA has not, right now in the process of coming up with regulations, and what do you do with that type of thing, and how do you manage the regulations associated with fracking? So if you're a scientist, I think it's a very exciting time. You want to talk about telecommunications, net neutrality, type 2 regulation, Title 2 regulation of the companies. How do you manage the information pipeline? How do you do that? And so there are enormous number of opportunities, and I would be, if I'm a scientist, I would look into public space and see how I can really address the public policy issues. Because a lot of the times people who are making policies, they have no idea. They have no idea they're making public policy. Neuroscience, hardly anybody is a neuroscientist in the legislature. And, there are one doctor, in the state legislature. And I think that's why you play a role. You don't have to run for office. You can play that advocacy role or regulatory body doing the scientific work. But I think the key here is that you are to target your message to the audience. You have to understand the audience and how you can take the same thing, whether it is making it into one sheet of paper. Sometimes I have seen a congressman, they are walking from meeting to another meeting, and the staffer is running with them and briefing them on what they're going to be talking about at the next thing. And unless they are, they have this brain theory that is evolved, that phenomenal brain that can absorb, consolidation that takes place, coalition, accidents of the, meeting of the long-term memory and the short-term memory, and they're able to go and talk about those issues. So I think, this is, I will be excited as a scientist to be studying now. There are many opportunities, and once again, thank you for this opportunity.
I want to amplify one point that both Heather and Upendra referred to, is what happens in government, in the legislature, in Congress or the state legislature, gets almost all the attention and the drama. But in terms of thinking about careers, in New Jersey, as Upendra said, there are 120 state legislators. There are probably 500 jobs being staff around those state legislators. In the executive branch of government, in the departments of health and senior services or environmental protection, there are a total of probably 50 to 60,000 jobs. So if you start thinking about the idea government might be attractive, there's a whole lot to look at in that part of the world that gets a little less attention sometimes. I think what our plan was to have comments among the panelists first, and questions or comments that anyone wanted to add at this point. All the panelists took much less time than they were offered, which is a rare event.
No, I didn't want to take
Right.
monopolize. I mean, I think it's good to have some dialogue, and we can always
Yeah,
talk
okay,
on
well,
that.
let's
I
open
think.
up
There's a
to,
lot of smart folks in this room.
Yeah.
Let's listen to them.
So Mary Nugent, I'm a professor here at Rutgers.
Just give me 1 second, Mary, I'm just gonna get rid of the microphones, which is actually conveniently right behind you. There you go.
So again, the name is Mary Nucci. I'm a professor here at Rutgers. I teach courses related to science communication, perceptions of science. And my question regarding politics, so it may be directed to Howard and Upendra mostly, and I'm sorry, I just got your name wrong, but everybody.
Correct. Upendra is correct.
Okay, thank you. As I'm working with students and I'm talking to them about the role of evidence in decision-making, the one thing that we run up against is this issue of culture. And we see it in politics where you may have a politician refusing to take a stance on perhaps vaccines or fracking because it will impact their reelection. And so how do you get past, I'm curious how you get past, and is there a way to get past this role of culture so that you have evidence that points to what is, we'll say, the best choice or the correct choice in a decision, but you're struggling against people who don't want to take a stance because they don't want to not be reelected, or they personally have a perspective on that scientific evidence that is counter to what the evidence says. So this is one thing I'm trying to figure out, to explain to my students how they, as they go out into the world, they should be active citizens, helping politicians to make decisions by speaking to them and writing and lobbying, whatever. But how do you deal with that? Getting people to move past
Great question.
culture to strictly evidence.
Yeah, I just want to, I have re-elected 6 times, so 7 times I was elected to the state legislature. I have taken position on various things. And when you take a position, you got to have conviction. When you do anything, you got to have conviction. You got to have certain fundamental beliefs. And you have to be careful in that, you don't, a lot of times what happens to the media and the message, it gets really distorted. People just take it out of context, what you said. And I've said a lot of things. I know that whatever I said was taken out of context many, many times. I think one of the things I found is that if you really believe in something and people are willing to give you that chance, and a lot of times we don't even take that risk. That's what I believe in, taking risk, because when I left India, I didn't have anybody here, so I took big risk of my life. So I think that is what politicians today lack, that they don't take the risks necessary because they have to stand up for something, and they don't do that because of the short-term focus of getting re-elected. But I think the way I found is that you don't have to be the mouthpiece for everything, right? You have advocacy groups that are there, and use them and try to let them be the mouthpieces, and then you are encouraging the dialogue. As a politician, that's what you're doing. You are trying to do public good, and you are engaging the dialogue and talking about the things. And I think that's one way you can at least get 60, 70% of the way. And at some point or the other, you have to make the decision. Whether you believe in this or that. A lot of the times, I give you an example regarding the fracking issue. 120 legislators in the state were given the opportunity to go and visit a site where the fracking actually occurs. And there was only one legislator who took the opportunity, because it's one full day of investment. It was in Western Pennsylvania. You had to go early morning, come back late in the evening, heavy rainy day on a Friday, and it's not the pretty thing. But decision making requires understanding and the data, and I think that's where I think a lot of public is very silent about it. Also, a lot of the times there are advocacy groups are there. They believe in one thing. Sometimes they use that particular issue for fundraising for that organization. They're not 100% either. So, and then most of the public, they're just they're spectators. They think they're watching a real life TV or something like that. They do not participate. So I think that's where you got to engage the people, and if they believe in something, how many people know about people talk about coal is bad, right? When I go out there. I'm part of the National Association of Regulatory Utility Commissioners. Before that, I was part of the National Conference of State Legislatures. I do come in contact with legislators from or regulators from Montana, Wyoming, Nebraska, who they thrive on this coal, and they push this concept called clean coal. I said, what's clean about coal? When you burn it, it kills you. When you after it's burnt, the coal ash, that also kills you. So what's good about it? But having said that,
But it sounds good, clean coal. Somebody was smart to think of that name, right?
But it had to be realistic, though. When you have 38% of the energy comes from coal, it affects a lot of people's livelihood. It's not so much about, it's an emotional issue, people's jobs, Same thing, immigration, when you talk about, or you talk about, I took a lot of hit on outsourcing and offshoring. So because I'm from India, I was born in India, came here, they think that I am here to take all the jobs from America to India, personally. I said, it's not possible. But I was criticized by the labor organizations, I was criticized by my own colleagues in the legislature saying that you are for outsourcing. I said, I was talking more about as a scientist, as a data. I said, look, it's the economics of it. You got to see how you can. For example, the State Department in the Treasury, they were trying to do some, I guess, actuarial models. Modeling they had to do for the bond financing and all that. And the people who do the actual things are not here. And a lot of the Wall Street companies, they have to go to India, other countries to get that thing. When you put a law saying that anytime the state does business, it has to be done in the state of New Jersey or in the United States, you will never get that actual economics that is done. So I think there is, so you have to speak up, and you don't have to be, bravo, and then you got to be beating your chest, but I think you can do it tactfully.
So I'll jump in. I would agree that having the right messengers is really important. So, and associating with the right substantive advocates is really smart. And you did that so well when you were in the assembly. So I think that point of how you use advocates on the outside. So as an example, when I was Commissioner of Health, we were the first state to require the flu vaccine for entry into preschool. And that was controversial, and but to aligning with the New Jersey chapter of the American Academy of Pediatrics obviously was a very important thing for us to do, to have the right messengers to be amplifying that. But sometimes I think, the really smart politics is how you can insulate it from politics. So I'll give you an example. When the Affordable Care Act was being debated in Congress, women senators wanted to make sure that contraception was going to be covered. And the way they did that actually was not to say contraception is going to be covered, was to say that preventive services will be covered, and to defer to the Department of Health and Human Services and an administrative process to determine what services should be considered preventive. And, because they were confident that contraception is a preventive service, and when deferring to the U.S. Preventive Services Task Force, and actually the IOM got involved, that process would lead to that conclusion that contraception would be covered. But having a big drawn out legislative fight about the coverage of contraception was going to be ugly politically, and actually it was better to defer to the science on that, and to create a process that did defer to the science on that. And I'm not as familiar, John, so maybe you'll correct me, but my sense is that's what goes into things like the Endangered Species Act. You don't want Congress every year deciding which owl or frog is endangered. You want to create a process by which Congress says, we care about endangered species. we want to do what we need to do to protect endangered species, but we're going to let folks at, I guess it's the Department of Interior, right? Every year think about what species gets listed or delisted depending on the science, and then species come on and off depending on the science. But it wouldn't be smart advocacy to create a legislative structure in which you had Congress every year deciding which, because you can imagine the politics that go into that, and you want scientists to be looking at the research. So, so I think, so it was an interesting example of, so what ended up happening under the Affordable Care Act is preventive, so Congress sort of establishes the broad structure and says, we believe preventive services are important and should be, not only should they be covered, but they should be covered at no cost to beneficiaries, to all these new people who are getting health insurance coverage. And then they defer to Health and Human Services, who gets IOM involved, and U.S. Preventive Services Task Force. And eventually where you end up with is that all contraception is now covered, not only is it covered, but it's covered at no cost. So, downstream, what does that mean? That means birth control pills are covered. So IUDs, all the different, whatever's FDA approved methods of contraception are now covered. And, but it started with Congress saying, we value preventive services, and then you're letting scientists determine what that preventive service is.
It's part of the process we're all taking for granted. Let me just explain in case, which is that Congress or a state legislature passes a law and assigns implementation of that law to an agency, to the Department of the Interior, and then that department prepares rules and regulations that are the more specific parts of how that law is being implemented. So that's what Heather.
That's right, fills in the details, and that's so. Affordable Care Act passed in 2010, but why in 2015 are we still talking so much about it? Because it's so many details needed to be worked out at the administrative agency level, and that's where there can be so many interesting staff roles, because there's so much work to be done to flesh out those details.
Yeah, one of the things if I jump in on a couple of things I want to add. One is that when the messaging for Affordable Care Act, one thing was really missing is that you are creating access to health care for all the citizens of America. I think that's the message was lost. I think a lot of the times people, they start attacking, it became Obamacare and all the stuff. Access, people are denied access to health care. As an individual, you're not able to go out and get health care until this Affordable Health Care Act came along. I think that's one of the major pieces. I think a lot of the congressmen blew it, and I think and
Well, it actually relates to this issue, which is that so the law's passed in 2010, but it's so complicated, it takes years to implement, and that's actually the reason we have this communications vacuum, is that people don't start seeing the benefits of the law for years because you're working out so many details. And so you've got this vacuum during which, to go back to the communications perspective, it's very easy to attack a law that people aren't benefiting from yet. Right? So, if you look back, actually, Medicare was implemented in 6 months. If you'd had 5 years, if it had taken 5 years to implement, perhaps there would have been a different story. Also, obviously, the political climate is totally different now than it was in 1965.
But I think it's an important message, for people who want to get into the public policy area. It's how you take that message, right? If I think I still little disagree with Heather that I don't think the legislators who voted for the Affordable Health Care Act, they were doing justice to that act because they didn't know, they didn't understand the law. I think I don't think any American would be against providing access to health care. I don't think so. That message never resonated. At least that's my observation, yeah. So I wanted to give another legislation since you brought. So Heather is smart. I sit next to her, I get ideas. So I think also the dean bringing my neurosciences really working, all my neurons working. Now, I give you an example. In New Jersey, when you are a prison inmate, right, if you go into the prison, and when you make a phone call, you are supposed to communicate with your family. When you communicate with your family, it reduces your chances of the recidivism, going back and all that. But what New Jersey was doing was something very bad. What they were doing was, if you make a collect, they don't have cell phones, they collect call they have to make. And when they make the collect call, their family has to pay 4 or 5 times than you and I pay. which is not a good thing, right? And I had one of my colleagues who wrote a legislation, we had to cut down the prisoner, phone call rates. Now, no legislator wants to touch the prisoner issue, right? Because it's not, prisoners are not voting for you. They don't have rights to vote for you, right? You just completely. Now then it's, somebody say, if you're how do you get across the aisle support for that thing? It's very difficult. So the advocacy group came to me, I'm the chairman of the Assembly Telecommunications Committee. So, Assemblyman, we want you to help us with this thing. So I came up with it, just like she said, endangered species example. I said, why are we charging them so much? And then I studied the law. And it so happens when the Board of Public Utilities was regulating the telecommunications, there's some agencies were excluded from their regulation. So what happened, the prisons, Department of Correction is part of the state that was excluded. So they were able to go to a third-party provider and charge, there was an agreement between the state and the third-party provider, and they were charging, they were actually bilking the prisoners, which is totally wrong. So what I did was, no agency should be exempt from this BPU. They should all be regulated by the BPU. Now, I got that law passed in less than 6 weeks. And the question is, will the governor sign it? That was a challenge, right? And so I presented this as a compassion issue. It is also, you want to, it is costing the state a lot of money when people, if you don't reduce the recidivism. So I presented it from an economic point of view. And the governor, on the day of he was getting sworn in for his second term, he told me, Upendra, I signed 2 of your legislations today. That was one of the legislations. Let me talk about the second legislation.
Let me bring Tom into the discussion here.
I'm just listening.
Okay, all right.
I would actually invite, we've got one question,
yeah,
a lot
yeah.
of smart folks in the room,
Yeah.
I'd love to hear what they have to think.
And we didn't address the one question, but what if but we get to that. Janet?
I have a question for Tom. So the issue of faculty.
Sorry, can you please just use the mic? And please just state your name and your Rutgers affiliation since we're filming. Thank you.
Janet Alder, Graduate School of Biomedical Sciences. So the issue of faculty buy-in, I want to hear your perspective on how to get faculty to agree to encourage their students to pursue paths, and also related to the other speakers, what do you think the role of the university or academia is in encouraging their faculty to communicate their own research and work out to politicians and and to help form policy? Like, is there a role for them in conveying that forward?
Sure. There are 2 separate questions, both really important. Let me take the latter first because it maps exactly onto what my colleagues were talking about, and I take your point completely. It's if you want to get something, from our point of view in the neurosciences, if you want to get something done, you don't go to a congressman, you go to a staffer. And you grab the staffer and sit down with him or her and talk about the issues in short forms, but it always has to be less than a page. And frankly, and I know this sounds facetious, if we can't explain what we do in less than a page, something's wrong. I mean, if I start learning memory, you don't have to know what the 5' end of a molecule is to know that memory matters. And so a lot of times, I don't think it's hubris. I think it's not appreciating that you can communicate what you do with the passion that you share about it at a level that folks can wrap their heads around. Man, he's an expert at this. I mean, talk to someone whose kid has autism. You don't have to talk about a particular protein. I could give you the name of it. You talk about suffering and the fact that there's too much protein in there and we've got to get rid of it, and you get at a level that you can engage. The tension is not to oversimplify, but on the other hand, by that I mean trivialize, but you don't need the details in order to communicate the meat of it. And I would say, and I've been around a lot of terrific scientists, most of them are pretty darn good at it. You have to know the framing. That is, first of all, the timing, how much time you got, because we can talk for a minute or an hour. And secondly is who's the audience you're talking to. And then what do they want to know? So I think that I completely agree with my colleagues that we have an obligation. Listen, everybody in this room's mom and dad has paid for my research for the last 40 years. I'm not kidding. Y'all pay taxes, you've paid for my research. I owe that to you. I'm not doing you any favors. I owe you that information. If I'm reluctant to give it to you, then we gotta recalibrate sort of what this whole mission is for the public health service that funds my research and Manny's research and Janet's research in the service of trying to improve human conditions. So I think that's kind of a sea change in attitude, that you're not doing anybody favors. Get your fanny out there and talk to folks about what you're really doing, and not from an advocacy position. I think that's actually sometimes counterproductive. There is in Washington right now lots of folks that have suffering. Dad has Alzheimer's. My uncle has a Parkinson's. My kid has autistic. My kid has seizures. Horrible conditions at a human level melt your heart. In order to actually advance it, sometimes, ironically, these folks get in competition with one another. Not because each cause doesn't matter, it matters deeply, but in order to actually get movement, you have to have some sort of unified articulation. And that means being able, and you are both expert at this, to take a step back and ask the question that's the tough one sometimes. What's the optimal way to move forward? Not for me, but for the enterprise. And sometimes that means not taking all the steps you want the first time. As to engaging faculty, there's a lot of answers to it, but I'll give you the one that I think matters the most. It's incentivizing it. And I don't mean it with money. I mean to incentivize it as being a participant in the common weal. And recognizing being a participant in the common weal is something that is of value to the institution. You can also incentivize it other ways. For example, well, it does map onto it. So you folks know what indirect cost recovery is. When you get a grant, then there's additional monies given to the university to cover the expense of doing the grant. And that's a whole discussion we can have another time. But it was a revenue stream to my my college, 1,000 faculty, and I gave a piece of that back to groups with the rule that you couldn't ask for, and I would fund that with the rule being it can't be just a mini NIH grant or NSF grant or anything, just a small grant or something. It has to be something that has a very high likelihood of failing. It has to be really risky, and if it doesn't work, come back for more. If it does work, tell me what you did, come back for more. But to take risks. And among the things that were successful, and it does come back to perhaps something of interest to the room, there were 4 faculty members, 2 in politics, 1 in psychology, and 1 in molecular biology and big data, who teamed together and asked the question, by virtue of this seed money, I'll call it, did social media fuel Arab Spring? That was a few years ago. A big deal. Because if it did, it's important to know, and if it didn't, it's important to know. And it's in the culture that social media, so revolution starts at noon on Broadway, and if it's true, it's a sea change in the way the world works, right? So these young faculty got together, leveraged that to $1 million grant from NSF, leveraged that to more grants. They now have 55 students working full-time. Now it's an institute, social media and political thought and change. How does social media change? They studied the shutdown of the government 2 years ago. Do you all know what a word cloud is? Who knows what a word cloud is? Tell them what a word cloud is.
You look at different words and they're larger or smaller depending on frequency used.
Perfect.
And I mean, you can do it for a number of different things, how people conceptualize stuff, or just looking at, social media streams or any number of other things.
Perfect, exactly right. And so, and I had no idea what it was until these young men and women taught me about it. But the fact is they watched in real time when the government shut down a few years ago, the 2 word clouds, one from the left, one from the right. I don't even remember what the words were. One would probably be healthcare and one would probably be, socialism. I don't know what the word cloud would be. But what happened in day 3 is that half of a word cloud broke and went to the other side in real time. Why? Because folks back home were getting mad. They wanted their Social Security checks. They just wanted the government to work. And again, this isn't right-left. It's just they want the government to work. So what this captured was in real time, because all these guys are tweeting, or their staffers are tweeting, half of them wouldn't know how to tweet. Their staffers are tweeting, and in real time, they watch political thought move around in this space. That now has 50 young men and women going for a job in a space that didn't exist 5 years ago, right? So we incentivize those faculty to engage in an enterprise where young scientists could follow new paths. There's a deeper question for Janet that Janet asked that I'll only allude to, but then I'd love to hear the folks in the room who've had the experiences. The question is not even just valuing it, it's implementing it. And that's why iJobs is such a nice idea. Is with the PI that says, yeah, I've got this guy in my lab, he loves to teach, I should let him. Well, the way I did it was just let my guy teach. And he went out and he taught all summer, and he had a few courses so he could be competitive in the teaching marketplace, and he got a job. But if I had someone to go to and say, well, there's not just this opportunity, but 12 more in the neighborhood, then we're cooperating as a faculty, not just me, but as a faculty, in sort of implementing something that is got practical structural sort of knowledge that's required that no one of us have, but a team would have. So I don't know if that helps, if that gets to it, but that's, my.
I think we're going to take a break and come, and the schedule says a 20-minute break, and let's make it a 10-minute break. But I think one other part of that second question is to identify what the obstacles are. So, I mean, there used to be a program when there was a Cook College here, that you could be a Cook College student, do an internship in state government while you were studying, and then a direct career ladder where if you were good and they wanted to offer you a job, you could get a job and you didn't go through the civil service process, and it was a very direct path. Mm-hmm. That kind of thing is, you know, if you look at why it is when people say, well, I want to work in government, but, then that's not just the academy's even power to change that, mm-hmm. but it's to identify the problems and work with the government to do that. So let's take a 10-minute break, and then we'll come back and get more questions on the floor and discussion. What we're going to do is open the floor to a bunch of comments, but first just want to, one of the things that you find in any conversation is people use acronyms a lot and assume that everyone else in the room understands what they are. And so my advice is, if you're ever anywhere and you don't know what an acronym is, to ask, and you'll find that you're far from alone. So the one I just wanted to have explained was iJobs. There were a couple of references to that in the morning, and I did a little focus group in the break, and there are a number of people who don't know what that is. So Steve Melinek, you want to explain that?
My name's Jim Melinek. I'm Dean of the grad school here at Robert Wood called GSBS. I'm also PI, co-PI of iJobs.
Which means principal investigator, just another acronym.
PI. Oh, PI. We apply for a grant to NIH and we get it, right? And so then
Principal investigator.
Yeah, we're the principal investigator. And so I'm co-PI along with Mesh Yarmish, who is a distinguished professor over in BME. And so
BME.
biomedical engineering. and so,
graduate school
biological sciences, yeah. And so too many acronyms, I'm sorry, but the one that's important to really remember is iJobs. And so what is iJobs? And this came out of a workforce report from the NIH in that National Institutes of Health that that if you started grad school this year, you have less than 10% chance of having an academic job, but yet we only train our graduate students and postdocs for academia. So the goal of this grant from the NIH is to fill that educational gap. And so for our students and postdocs to learn about other opportunities outside of academia. And so Mesh and I are PIs, and then it's run by Janet and Suzel Engelhardt, who's also over in BME. And so we have 5 tracks. One of them is policy, that's why we're here. Another is big data that was talked about. Another is just business using pharma. Another is clinical regulatory testing, and then law. And the goal is that we leverage the new Rutgers, everything that's at Rutgers. We leverage New Jersey, everything that's in New Jersey, so that our students can go out there and have real life experiences and choose how they want to sort of use their degree, their PhD in different disciplines. And so that's basically the goal of the program.
Thanks. Okay, so what I want to do is go around the room and just get a number of comments or questions on the floor, and then have the panel respond. I would guess won't respond to all of them, but part of our goal here is to have this be an ongoing series of workshops and so the questions and comments may help generate an agenda for future sessions. Yeah, and please identify yourself as earlier.
Hi, my name's Dan Clark. I'm a Ph.D. candidate in ecology and evolution. And I guess, I mean, you know, all of you seem to have spoken about, and seems to be the focus here, about getting people in, you know, science, especially, you know, to, you know, think about and go into these careers, especially in government. And I actually also, I'm a teaching assistant, I almost said TA, for a environmental policy course that, you know, is half civics and half environmental policy. And, you know, part of what we try to do too is encourage the undergraduates to think about, you know, pursuing sort of the political implications of their careers. And I was hoping, you know, one of the things that I face professionally, you know, going forward, that I think a lot of our students do, is that, you know, pretty much the assumption, especially people in the field of ecology, and, you know, other environmental fields, is that you assume that all politicians are essentially, you know, in bed with big business and will sell you out to them. And, you know, time and time again, we've been proven correct. And not only that, but, you know, as Heather alluded to, you know, here you have your life's work, and you come up with these things that are very even clear and cogent, you know, like the CDC recommendation that, you know, no one should have any lead in their blood, and yet the New Jersey standard is still, what, 8 micrograms per liter in children. And, you know, so again, you know, no matter what you say, it seems like, you know, no one listens. And then on top of that too, you do speak out publicly, and we've had speakers come who, you know, were experts regarding the Gulf spill, who have been harassed, terrorized, and threatened by these, you know, large oil companies, and then also too had their grants, you know, NIH, NSF grants threatened by these legislatures. So I mean, in the face of all of that, I guess, one, you know, is it really responsible to be encouraging people to go into these fields? And also to, you know, could you just speak to, you know, that there are very real threats to you personally in speaking up and getting involved in politics and policy?
That's a great topic. Other comments and questions before we go to that one, to address that one? I thought there were a lot of, okay, well, why don't we respond? Who wants to start?
Well, you know, when you are in public life, public service, there's always a risk. There is an inherent risk in that. And I remember there was, when I was in the town council, it's a small thing, in Franklin Township, they had animal research. One of the labs was there in Franklin Township. And some of the animal activists coming from Europe. And we had, they were saying that as council member, your life is threatened. That's what they were telling us. But I think, you know, you have to take precautions. There is always, as soon as you step out of your bed in the morning, you know, there is risk. You know, you can fall down and break your leg. But I think the risk is there. What you need to do is how you're going to deal with that risk. I think that's the important thing. For example, you brought up the example of lead, and I remember I have a couple of legislations trying to see that the lead content, you know, reduction, and some of the schools in terms of the lead paint, use of the lead paint and all that. There was strong support for that. When it comes to, you have to put it in the proper context. You know, if it affects children, you know, there is. And every legislator will push over and try to be the first one to do that. And I think you have seen that with respect to autism. Autism rates have gone up in the state of New Jersey, and there is not a single legislator is going to come up and challenge your science in terms of course, you know, New Jersey is a democratic state. Now, if you take that into the national scene, there are people who come from that. But I think you have to try to get to them sometimes, you know, you have to have private conversations and try to see with the staffers. I mean, they can, you don't deal with the congressmen or senators directly. It's very hard to get to them. But you can talk to the staffers. I think there is a belief there. So there is optics, you know, from an election point of view, there are certain things they do, and there are certain fundamental beliefs are there. My advice to you is that you know, things change. It's a cyclical thing. You know, sometimes people come and they go, and legislatures, the governors, president, they all come and go. I think, you know, your message ecology and whether it's the content of lead, content of arsenic, for example, all these things are very important. I think you have to stick to that. I mean, if you don't do that, who else will? You have a responsibility to do that.
I'm struck by the way you posed the question so well. Is it responsible of us to encourage you? It's really, it's a great question. I will say, I may not be as bad as you think. I don't know, maybe that's not fair, but my big motto is always, when you talk about government, never assume malevolence when mere incompetence will do. So I don't assume that everybody saw that, right? Maybe that's a little comfort, but
Right.
don't assume everybody has. But you're right, you raise a good point. Like in the public health sphere, we've been trying to get people to think about gun violence as a public health issue. And there's been the prohibition on CDC funding research on guns. And so, there's this amazing statistic that we now have more injuries resulting from guns than from motor vehicles, right? That the lines have actually crossed. And so we've done epidemiologically a great job addressing, it's not a perfect job, but we've made a lot of progress on making cars safer and roads safer and drivers safer, and sort of using tools of public health to address. So anybody who's in New Jersey knows, the jug handles, right? Jug handles, a great invention, which maybe you don't realize, driving on the roads, but making our roads safer. All of those epidemiological tools could be used on gun violence to make the product safer, the user safer, the environment safer. But CDC has been prohibited from doing research there. Now, the Obama administration lifted that ban, but Congress hasn't appropriated, it's not happening. And so that's a great example of, if you're a researcher at Hopkins School of Public Health and want to do that kind of research, are you going to have blowback because Congress doesn't want you to do this kind of research? And so, I don't know. Tom, do you have an answer? Is it responsible for us to, it's a great question.
I think it's not only a great question, I think it's a deep responsibility. And it's a little bit like starting in Los Angeles and saying, let's drive a bus to England. And we tell you, well, just keep going east, it's going to get okay. When you hit Montana, you're sure it's going to be, just keep on going, we're getting there, right? I have no political acumen, but I can tell you the cynicism that you share, I share every day. I had a young guy who was in my lab at Yale who ended up going as a staffer, and he loves it, and he's named Andy Fish, and he's very, very successful at local levels. And I don't presume to be hubris for me to have an opinion about politics, but I do know it's almost as important to get a stop sign at the end of your street as to get a congressional act. So if you start locally and what we've done in neuroscience at least is get your congressman into your lab and have them meet the students and see the stuff, not just the gee whiz, you put on a dog and pony show of cloning a gene or something, but to meet the young future and say, these are your constituencies, and go back down the street. Don't go to Washington, I know about Washington, just go down the street and care about them. So my own instinct, and it's, I must say, impoverished because I don't have the experience to back it up, is to begin locally and at a granular level with groups that you can speak to and have them appreciate the importance of what you're doing and build out from that. That said, I think you're spot on, and I don't have a glib answer for it at all.
My answer would be, government's the only game there is. So, and I think it's a luxury to give in to the cynicism that probably we all feel. So that's one part of the answer. Second part, I would say, is I think there's a lot of drama and over-dramatization of, so I think probably the three of us who've been in government could tell great tales of stormy public meetings and times when there were maybe threats or not. Maybe there's data, otherwise I don't think it's the norm. I think and I think people, when decisions go against them, are always critical of the process, regardless of what the process was. And finally, I think there's some going on, not almost the driving to England thing, but going on faith, that what we talked about the last session when Paul Offit was here, of people advocating vaccinations and having opposition, and a moment arising with the epidemic, or the
Measles
measles epidemic, where all that work that had been going on for years was able to be used when the moment arose, and without, it couldn't have been started that day. So,
That's a great point.
Dean, I don't know about you, but I'm a believer. The other day I saw in US 1 a Hawaii license plate. So anything is possible.
Other questions, comments you want to put up? Yeah, Tom.
Sorry, please use the microphone.
My name is Joe Melton. I'm a previous academic at UMDNJ and have now worked in medical communications for 15 years. And I really appreciate the logic of science, and I'm glad that policymakers do too. A common way of getting around it that I see these days is, yes, that's a wonderful solution, but we can't afford it, And that's becoming the argument in all of the major environmental issues we're having. And I would ask you, how do you address that issue? Or do we have to establish some sort of, if it costs less than this or more than that, we're going to have a cutoff? Or what do you do in that situation?
Does that mean you don't want to answer?
That means I have no insight.
Okay.
Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to be glib, just the opposite. I demurred. If you're asking me, I think that is a big question. And not only afford, but the question is, what does it mean to afford? Afford is, we can afford to do a lot of things if we put our mind to it. It's a question of priorities, not just affording. And when you put a price tag on something in the out years, anything is a phenomenal investment. I guess what I would hope is that one of the elements of the calculus is not money, but impact and importance to the human condition. For example, there are some diseases that are within gunshot, within 10 years of, I won't say cure, but certainly management. In our lifetime, in your and my lifetime, we've seen a disease that was a death sentence go to not a death sentence. It's called AIDS. Happened to be in the immune system. We could talk why that was possible. But when I was a young guy over at NYU as a postdoc, first AIDS patient happened, it was considered a death sentence. It's not anymore. So there are things that we can do to mitigate human suffering in my trade. That's what I care most about. But I think that I would hope part of the calculus of affordability is not just the price tag, but another vector in that calculus is the importance to the human condition.
It's a great,
Oh, go ahead.
I mean, I think we have, obviously we're lacking an investment agenda nationally, and it's not gonna happen at states levels, because budgets have to be balanced. There could, at least Tom's construct can happen at the national level, where you can have a little bit longer budget window, and you can talk about investments in the human condition. But to be a little bit of a Debbie Downer, when you look, for example, at the Affordable Care Act, there was a big debate about creating and they ended up landing on an institute that looks at comparative effectiveness, not cost effectiveness. And so big debate because of concerns about rationing. And so nobody wants to ration, but what that means is we end up rationing. We just don't call it rationing. And so there's a real cognitive dissonance there. So I don't have a good answer on that. It's another good question.
I can give one example. New Jersey, we have energy master plan, and we have a requirement of 22.5% of energy should come from the renewable energy sources, solar, wind, and all that. And offshore wind is, New Jersey does not have many resources. We don't have any shale gas, at least, which is, we can harvest in a reasonable, cost-effective manner. We have solar energy. We had done a lot of policies regarding that. There was a lot of pushback, and we had to, both the Board of Public Utilities and the legislature, we stuck with it, and we are able to advance that legislation. And now offshore wind, we don't have any wind onshore, but we have offshore wind. And if we look at, right now, you have to look at the cost, 17 cents per kilowatt hour, that's what you pay for right now. And if you bring in offshore wind, let's say it costs 24 cents or something like that, there is a cost factor that has to be factored in. So we need to look at, that's why the legislation I authored for Offshore Wind Economic Development Act, we talked about the net economic benefit to look at the environmental impact and other health impacts. All those things are factored in, and we need to factor all those things in, and you have to go with the proper data. A lot of times people say, this is good, do it because it looks clean. But I think you need to substantiate your assumptions, and we have to provide the necessary data to convince people. I think you have to do that. It's become more necessary now than before. Before we had resources that were not that limited. Now we have tremendous limitation on resources. From the federal government to the state and the state to the locals.
Manny?
Just one, as Mandy gets the microphone, one thing that occurs to me is that when you make the calculus that we're talking about for affordability, an interesting thing to look at is the net budget of the United States and how it commits dollars to stuff. And look at the budget, for example, defense, and ask whether that defense budget is defendable. I'm not taking a political position, but in terms of cost effectiveness. Just like we're held accountable for deliverables, just in terms of cost effectiveness, how much rigor is there in that budget? Because in terms of the net, the aggregate budget that this is the rounding error on the aggregate budget.
True.
So I really wanted to ask all the panel members a question. As a member of the Society for Neuroscience, one of the things that I've been trained to do is to communicate we have these Capitol Hill days each year. We go down and spend a day with staff that supports us and tells us how to present our science. They teach us what they call the so-called elevator speech, 3 to 5 sentences. What do you do? Why do I care? And what do you want? And you got to practice that because it's pretty challenging and scary. But those experiences have been very useful for me to understand the community I need to be speaking to. But each of you have worked across your disciplinary boundaries, and I just thought maybe you could comment. Tom, I'm going to call on you first because I didn't get to go to the education summit that you organized, where you brought most of the health and education of the U.S. government to California to try to teach them what science could do to change education policy. What were the barriers, and what would somebody here who wanted to participate in that? Where do you enter? I mean, and conversely, how do you in government, when you need a scientist, what does that look like when you look for someone? I mean, do you literally ask a friend, do you know somebody, or do you do a web search? I mean, what are those real entree points when they leave my lab to go out there and join the real world?
So I'll just briefly comment. What Manny's referring to is when I was president of the society, one of the privileges you have is having initiatives, and mine was on neuroeducation. And we brought to Irvine, where I was at the time, exactly what you said. We brought government and national and state legislators. We brought educators. We brought neuroscientists, cognitive scientists, teachers in the trenches. And it took a while to get a common vocabulary. It really did. You got to spend some time with a libretto just saying, what do you mean by that? And so it took about a half a day to sort of settle in. But I thought it was extremely productive in a lot of ways. And I'm happy to go into it in detail later, maybe offline if I don't want to take too much time now. But one of the things that was very clear is that it was some of the communication was sort of like lasagna. That is, there's layers, but there's not a lot of orthogonal communication. So if you talk at the level of policy, then there's a whole vocabulary, and not just vocabulary in the sense of word to use, but strategies for solving problems. And then you drill on down, and you encounter a lot more. For example, I don't know how many of you are teachers, have moms, dads, or teachers, but it's very easy to tell teachers, because I talk to them all the time about science education. I love it. I tell teachers, here's a really cool thing to do in your curriculum, and she or he is in the trenches delivering, right? I mean, she goes to work, gets out of the car, walks in, and there's 50 kids, probably 40 kids, unless you're privileged, 40 kids. And now, if she wants to innovate, she's got to roll it up to her principal. He has to roll it up to a school board. He has to roll it up to the state legis. Then it has to roll it up to policy. And the ability to innovate, even if the will is there, the energy's there, and the ATP to stay late is there, there's phenomenal blocks in the way. And my wife was a teacher for years, so I saw this in real time because she was frustrated all the time doing this. But I came to realize how systemic it was, that even with all the right information, and I can tell you cool things to do that would enhance the learning policy, at what cost? And if you look at another, I think you just handed me a soapbox. If you look at what's get cut first, the things that get cut first when budget gets cut are exercise, music, the arts, all the things you really need. And the evidence for the connection between, for example, exercise, the music, and math is phenomenal. I can talk to you about that. But it's sort of play, you don't need it. So we'll start excising. Again, a question of priorities of budget cuts, right? And you just go, really? But so I came away educated and I won't say depressed, but at least more appreciative of the barriers that can exist across those barriers. The last thing is there are a lot, and I think this goes back to your point, John. I think it's really important is to be a critical thinker, but not a cynical thinker. I mean, we got a world. We got to deal with the world we got. And a lot of these legislators, a lot of these policymakers, a lot of the principals, they're good folks trying to get the job done too. And so, and no one's saying this, so I'm creating a straw man, but rather than creating how many barriers are there, is how many barriers can we break down? Who do I talk to just get around a table with a cup of coffee and say, let's just take a risk. You know, just what may we do at that local level? And in the neurosciences, it caught fire. There's a whole cadre of folks that now do neuroeducation, and there's young men and women that come up to that group at the neurosciences every year and look for ways to get involved locally at their homeschool level. So maybe that I'll stop so that other people have a chance.
Well, I'll just pick up because it sounds like that was a great convening that you had, and I would say a couple of principles. One, deal with staff, not just principals, or principals is the term we use in politics for like the head person, so the member of Congress or the agency director. So staff are really important, and I think you have to cultivate those relationships. So those Hill visits are terrific.
Or just let me say, interrupt, or be that staff. I mean,
Or be that staff, yeah, absolutely. And so we always, AAAS fellows on the Hill do amazing work. So I don't know if you guys, encourage the AAAS. For the advancement of science. And they have a policy fellowship that's fabulous and puts people
This
in.
woman knows her stuff. You are the dictionary in the room.
That's right. That's
every
right.
acronym, she just has it nailed.
So they will pay to put. I think they're they postdocs usually. I'm trying to remember who we would have, but. They have PhDs and they come spend a year on the Hill. And what's great is that's often how you get hired, is you're sort of there, and then literally somebody leaves to go to grad school, somebody leaves to get taken to the job, and they're like, oh, you know how to do this, we'll put you on payroll, right? That means I'm a big believer in being in the right place at the right time, and so those kind of fellowships put you in the right place, and they give you credibility and experience, and then all of a sudden the Committee on Science Technology is looking for somebody, and you've spent a year interning in an office. So those fellowships are great. So be a staffer or cultivate the staff, and it's not just those visits are great, Manny, that you're talking about, but then I think some of this stuff seems obvious, but not everybody does it. It's the note you write afterwards where you say, I really enjoyed meeting you and hearing about X, and hope I can be a resource to you, and then inviting the staffer back. I think you mentioned this too. There's nothing, staff, it's great. You love to be able to come to the district. And so when I was working for a senator from New Jersey, Rutgers and Princeton sometimes would have us to come up. Because industry is doing it too. To go back to your point about industry, pharma is inviting staff to come tour. It's great if you can do that too. But it's cultivating. So it's not. There's somebody did a study. You have to send something 7 times to a Hill staffer to get them to, at all, pay attention to it, right? And so there's that cultivating. That visit is important in making the human connection, but then the following up, and then it becomes, to your question of when you need somebody, then it becomes, oh yeah, wasn't there that guy at Princeton who seemed cool, and I'll call him, and then somewhere in my Rolodex. So cultivating.
No, I look at it as a sales model, right? It's marketing is getting a piece of your real estate of your brain. And so you need to, I used a sales model where you generate the leads, where you're trying to, that's prospecting, look at people who will be favorable to your message, whatever your message it might be. And then they can, in turn, have access to other decision makers in this case, if you're dealing with the lawmakers, legislators, and the influencers, I think, are the staff. I think you need to engage as many as possible. And also, you don't have to, I look at this, the elevator speech is the closing. So you have a prospecting, qualification, and closing. But you have a lot of work you have to do to get to the elevator speech. I think you need to do a lot of work and get them information. And one I think Heather mentioned is that when you offer somebody, hey, I could be a resource in this particular area, please call on me, I make myself available. I think that goes a long way in terms of people are looking for, everybody is resource constrained, and so they're looking for people who they can call, pick up the phone. If I have healthcare issue, I call Heather, and she has energy issues, she will call me. Like that, you have to create that network, and you should propagate like a virus on the Capitol Hill and in the state houses around the country.
Other comments or questions? We could break. Yes.
So my name is Maria Quadri. I'm a graduate student in the biomedical engineering and computational biology and molecular biophysics programs. I'm also a co-president of our national science policy group here at Rutgers. And so we actually we had the same opportunity to go do some of these Congressional Hill visits. And so it goes kind of to your comment that you made earlier, John, that we don't do politics. But one of the things that they emphasized to us when they were training us on how to speak is to not say, well, maybe you should take money from here, or this is not the issue that should be your priority. Our issue should be the priority. So when you say you don't do politics, what is the way to do politics? Because it seems that politics is mostly consensus building. And a lot of that is just communicating and reminding people of the bigger picture, taking that step back. These are all phrases that you guys have used repeatedly throughout today. So how are we supposed to be the best advocates that we can be and actually get more involved in doing politics without creating those boundaries?
That's a good question. I think part of it is whether or not you say to the Hill staffer, this is what I think you should do, is to understand what they can do. So if you're lobbying Heather when she was the Commissioner of Health and Senior Services, she can't change the law that she's charged with implementing, but maybe she could change the regulation, or she's operating under the regulation, and maybe she could change the decision. I found when I was in the Department of Environmental Protection, the advocates who were most effective, whether they were coming from environmental groups or coming from lawyers representing developers, were those who could say, well, in this regulation here, you have the ability to interpret it to my favor, and I could decide whether or not I wanted to do that, but they were sometimes more creative certainly than I was, or than the staff I worked with was. So that's all. That's what I mean, is understanding the context of what they're able to do and not able to do, whether or not they want to do it.
The only comment I would make about the approach is nobody likes to be told what to do. Nobody likes to be given the solution you're seeking. So, and I'm not implying you did that, but I'm going to cartoon it, that they probably know their budget pretty well. So if I have a faculty member comes to me, all the time at Yale, people come and say, take it out of the endowment, because Yale has a huge endowment. Take it out of the endowment. And you got all that money, just take it out of the endowment. And I don't want a lot, a couple $1 million. Come on, it's surrounding around your endowment. Give me a break. And the principle that guides the endowment management, and might guide this conversation as well, is what's called remaining generationally neutral, which means don't do anything now that will harm the future, and don't do anything in the future that will harm the present. So there's what's called a spending rule. And most universities with endowments, we don't, MOU have much of an endowment, so it's not an issue, but big universities have spending rules that implement that. So for someone to presume they know how the university should deploy their money, or when I have a faculty member come to me and say, well, all I need is this amount, well, I got a bucket and a ladle. That's what I got, is a bucket and a ladle, and everything I spoon out of that leaves less water in the bucket. So what I ask faculty to do, and not trying to be icky about it, but just straight is, well, what do you want me not to do so I can do that? Because I got a bucket and a ladle. So if I'm going to start something, I got to stop something. And that usually is a conversation freeze. Usually they start saying, oh my gosh, look at the time, or something. and it's not even trying to be clever or facetious. It's more like trying to communicate that there are limitations on resources, and I'm on your side. So let's do it. But what are we not going to do in order to do that? Because you don't just, there's no incremental stuff. So I think that one of the things is realizing the pressures on the budget you're looking for, and then communicating to whoever the stakeholders you're talking to, what can we do together to solve this? Rather than do this in the expense of that, don't do that. How can we put our heads together to solve this? And my guess is sometimes if we don't stop doing that, but reframe that and this to put it in the shared space of a solution, it allows a little more positive attitude of, I'm not trying to rob from anybody else. What I want to do is, as a collaborator, look for solutions that are feasible. I don't know if that helps. But
I want to bring this to a close, I think, and we have lunch, and you're all invited to stay and continue the conversation. Just want to say in closing, the Eagleton Fellowship Program is a program we have for 27 graduate students, and we're in the process of choosing fellows for next year, so it's maybe more on my mind. But we go to great lengths to have a diverse group of students who are racially diverse, ethnically diverse, come from all 3 Rutgers campuses, are Democrats and Republicans. But the thing that the fellows say each year was the most significant part of the program for them was getting to meet people in other disciplines, the fact that it's interdisciplinarily diverse. So I really applaud you, the students who are here today, and thank you all for coming, and hope you'll continue to come here and continue to discuss these issues. And thanks to the panel. This was great.
Thank you.
Thank you.